All right, and I'm going to share my screen with a PowerPoint. I'm actually going to switch which screen I share. I want to move this. All right, maybe I'm going to share up here. Okay, so let's talk about assessing the current environment, and we're going to specifically focus on indirect assessment for this discussion. And this is chapter 3 in the latest edition of the book, and would be chapter 4 in the old edition. And so I put a post up about the books. It looks like both are in circulation. So my grad students switched over to the new edition last year. The undergraduates had been using the old edition because it goes through the book rental. And so I think this year, with everything going online, things got a little mixed up. And so everything went to the online, which was the new edition. And in fact, that's what I put in the syllabus. But I think the rental still had the old edition. And so either book is fine. They have the same content. The biggest difference with the new book is they combine chapters 1 and 2 and then renumbered. And so that'll be our biggest issue. But if you follow the chapter names instead of worrying about the numbers, you will be fine. So here, I'll put our classroom over here in the corner. So let's talk about indirect assessment. So when we do a functional behavior assessment, we will be collecting a lot of data. And the first parts of the assessment will be collecting informal data, or using indirect methods to collect data. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Before we get into the more technical parts of the FBA, we're going to do some background and some interviewing. And this part is usually pretty intuitive to students because you've done versions of this and other things you've done. And so I have this meme cartoon up because we really do, it really is important to collect data. And some people find it kind of aversive. You may have had negative experiences with data collection, or you may not feel like you have all the tools or skills for data collection. And so hopefully when you get through this course and you learn all the different pieces, it doesn't feel that way. And you get just as excited about data as I do. So let's go through our indirect methods. So the primary indirect method you'll be using for an FBA, for you because you'll be teachers, will be to interview teachers and caregivers. And so when you are in your field positions and student teaching position, you would mostly be interviewing teachers, most likely. It can be more difficult to find ways to get parents involved. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't, but it just means that sometimes the process moves along and there may not be a lot of opportunities for collecting data from parents. So when I speak, I'll be talking a lot about teacher because that's what's going to apply to you most, but I still want you to consider collecting information and interviewing caregivers as well. The more people you interview, the more information you're going to get. So I encourage you to gather as much as you can and want. But if you're only able to interview one person, then you want to focus on the one who has the most experience and spends the most time with the student. The primary goal of your interview is going to be to start to define what that challenging behavior is. And we want to work toward having an operational definition. So we want to have a definition that is measurable and observable. And people who aren't trained in behavior aren't necessarily going to report challenging behavior in this way because they're not trained to do so. And so it might be the case that they are going to say something more like the student is acting out, or the student is tantruming, or the student isn't getting things done. And those are vague definitions. And so your job in your interview will be to ask questions to help get at what that behavior definition is specifically. And one way to do this is to think about and ask about what that behavior looks like, because then people will start to share information that is more operational. So you'll ask questions to start to get a handle on that definition. And then you're also going to want to gather information about where that behavior is occurring so that you can observe it. You're never going to be in a position where you have time to observe all day for multiple days. No matter what your role is, you'll have to narrow that down. And so the best thing to do is find out, well, where does it happen most of the time? And that's where you can plan for most of your observations. So that will be very helpful. And so the interview gives us that information, some of that background on the behavior and where and when it's occurring. The book also talks about a student interview, and this is my take on student interviews. I think that interviewing the student can be very helpful, but should not happen during the FBA process, that it should happen after you've collected your FBA data. So some problems that can occur when you interview the student during the process, number one, is that you then are highlighting the fact that you are observing the student and that you're interested in their challenging behavior. And that is very likely then to lead the student to change their behavior because you're observing. So that can happen. Also, I don't feel like it is always very helpful in terms of gathering information to interview a student during the FBA process, because we as humans don't really have a great handle on why we do things all of the time. And so what is more helpful is for the student to talk about what motivates them, what challenges them, what kind of goals they have. And so my students in field in the past have been very successful in interviewing and speaking with, I mean, it doesn't have to be a formal interview, but speaking with and working with their students after the FBA is done, but before they create the behavior plan, to get student input and have the student be a part of that plan. I think that's very powerful. I think it's very, it's the ethical thing to do, really, that when the student can be involved, they should be. And so that's where I would put more energy, as opposed to trying to interview them while you're collecting data, because I think it's just going to complicate your data collection. And I'm not sure that most of the time students can share a lot of information that's helpful for that part of the process. I think they have a lot of insights about what motivates them, what challenges them, how they feel about how things are going, what sort of goals they have. And that really is more at the behavior plan development point. And so my recommendation is that you speak with students and get their input and have them involved after you're done collecting your data. Then you would want to get information from students and have them help with that behavior plan portion. Any questions about any of that so far? And I lost my chat bar, so if you put something in the chat bar, I can't see it right at this moment. All right. So a couple more things that we can do at this point in the process. The book talks about some standardized interviews that you can conduct as well, and I will be sharing on Canvas a couple of these tools. We have the FACS and the FAI, and these tools already have some questions laid out that you can use. So now the FAI, which is the Functional Assessment Interview Form, is very, very lengthy. And my recommendation to my students is that you would read through it and decide which questions might help you in your interview, but that you wouldn't necessarily ask all of them, because there are a lot. The other piece of advice that I give is, and really it's more of a, not just advice, but it's I would never recommend giving out that packet for someone to write out the answers. It would be very laborious, and I feel like would not get the information you needed. If someone had to write a bunch of things out, they would tire very quickly and would not want to complete that. So talking is better. Also, when you're talking with them, something someone says might lead you to a different question as opposed to going through in straight order. Maybe their answer answered 1 through 5 and you could jump down to 6. Or they said something really interesting and you want to follow up on that. And it doesn't matter that you wouldn't have had follow-up questions on that otherwise. And so I think it's great to use the FAI as a tool to give you ideas of questions and how you might word them. And then during the interview process, let that flow more naturally so that you can get the information you need. The facts, the other tool that I will share with you, is a one-page, it's 2 pages, but one side is for caregivers and one is for teachers. And it is more like a checklist. And this should never replace the interview because it wouldn't have enough depth. But what it can be super useful for is if you are only able to do a thorough interview with one person, maybe the main teacher or with a caregiver, and then you can use that form to get information from others. So maybe the student's primary teacher, you've interviewed them, and maybe the student goes to another classroom for math and then for PE, you could give that form to the math and PE teacher to get some additional information when you don't have time for an interview or they don't have time for an interview. So the tools can be useful to help supplement, but shouldn't replace the interview. And so I think it's important to consider the pros and cons of interviews. So the interviews can be very helpful because we can get information without spending a lot of time when we compare it to collecting quantitative data that we'll talk about later. You don't need a lot of training. So there are some types of interviews where people do need a lot of training, like forensic interviews, for example. But in the world of behavior analysis, you don't necessarily need a lot of training to ask the questions about what a behavior looks like, when it's happening, what occurs before the behavior, what happens after, things about intensity and patterns. You can ask all of those questions without a lot of training and get the information that you need. And you also can use the interviews to gain multiple perspectives. So you can talk to multiple people pretty easily and quickly and get information from what different people are seeing and from their different lenses. But we have to remember that there are limitations to an interview. And so interviews are subjective. You're going to get information based on what that person is experiencing. And so it's going to be subjective. And so some examples would be that we know from research that if a person, let's say a teacher, has just experienced the challenging behavior right before the interview, they're more likely to, without meaning to, report that it's more intense and or happens more often. So think about if you just get out of a stressful situation and now you're relaying that experience to somebody, you're more likely to talk about it in terms of how difficult, how challenging, how often it happens, that those things might be slightly exaggerated without meaning to, because you're still feeling the emotion of having been in that situation. And so things like that can happen during the interview process where people aren't very accurate, and not because they're trying to be dishonest, but because it's all happening from the lens of their experience. Also, if there's a behavior that is particularly intense, but maybe doesn't happen very often, people are more likely to report it as if it does. Because one time of a behavior happening that's very intense and aggressive, like a student maybe throwing chairs at a window or breaking things, is going to feel really big. And maybe it only happened 1 or 2 times, but those 1 or 2 times were a really big deal. And so they might be reported as something that happened a lot, because that felt like a lot. 2 times is a lot to have to clean up your classroom and put it back together and keep other students safe. But objectively speaking, our data, we would really only have 2 data points. And so we need both of those pieces of information. And that's why it's really important that we also observe. So we want to hear what people have to say. We want their perspective, but we need to remember it comes through their lens, and that we also need to see that behavior so we can collect the information that we need as well for the functional behavior assessment. And so we'll talk in later chapters and the articles that we'll read in here about collecting other types of data. The other thing we can do during this interview portion of the process, if you were in field, you could also be doing a records review. So you could look at the student's IEP and past IEPs, their evaluation scores on different assessments, and you could use that to help you get a picture of the student's experience in school. in areas where the student might be struggling and areas where the student might have strengths. And that can also help you as you write up your assessment and then think toward your behavior intervention plan. And so those two things would be the first steps of doing an FBA when you're working with an individual, when you have a student with you. And we will be going through this process for our final project. And I'm still working on bringing those materials together, but it will be a bit truncated because we'll be doing it with case studies and videos. And so we obviously won't have a very lengthy records review for that individual. And sometimes your students don't either. Maybe they moved to your district from somewhere else. And other times they maybe have been in special education for 15 years and you have a lot of records that you can go through. So that piece can really vary quite a bit. So that is the end of the PowerPoint. I'm going to pause for a minute and ask if you have questions or if there are pieces you want me to talk more about, either related to what I just talked about or other things in the unit as well. I will hit stop record since the lecture portion is over.